Hello, everyone, and welcome to FIT Authors Talk. My name is Brian Fallon, and I am the Interim Director of Faculty Development in the Center for Excellence in Teaching. This is my second time guest hosting the FIT Authors Talks, and I want to begin by reiterating my thanks to Greta Ernest and the Gladys Marcus Library for inviting me to participate in this excellent series showcasing some of FIT's newest faculty members. I also want to thank Jen Brady for her work coordinating this event. Today's author is Dr. Chloe Martin. Dr. Martin is an assistant professor of psychology in FIT's Department of Social Sciences in the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and a sleep medicine fellow in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at University of Miami. Her research examines psychological factors associated with cancer prevention and control in medically underserved populations, including racial and ethnic minorities, low-income families, and other at-risk populations. Dr. Martin has completed research projects that have focused on community health education, screening promotion, and symptom management in the African American cancer population. Her research has been supported by the Department of Defense, the National Cancer Institute, National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, and the National Science Foundation. Her published work appears in peer-reviewed journals, including the Journals of Psycho-Oncology, Stigma and Health, CHEST, Journal of Clinical Oncology, Annals of Behavioral Medicine, Patient Education and Counseling, the Journal of Racial and Ethnic Health Disparities, and eCancer Medical Science. Dr. Martin's talk today will cover her recent project entitled The Impact of Social Support on Psychological Distress Among Black Breast Cancer Survivors, the mediating role of fear of recurrence. Dr. Martin has prepared a presentation for her talk today. If you have any questions, I invite you to put them in the chat, and I will be happy to ask them for you at the end of the talk. Now it's my great pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Chloe Martin.
Yes, thank you so much, Brian, for that really great introduction. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for attending this symposium. And so I'm going to go ahead and get started. We all know what the presentation will focus on today, a manuscript that I'm currently submitting to a journal called The Impact of Social Support on Psychological Distress Among Black Breast Cancer Survivors. And we looked at the mediating role of fear of recurrence. So in this presentation, I'm going to provide background information on this topic, state the purpose, list the research questions and hypotheses, and describe the method and statistical analyses employed to answer the research questions. Then I will report the results, discuss them in the context of current literature, end with a conclusion, and then we can open the floor for comments at the end and address some of the comments in the chat. And so let's go ahead and start out with some cancer statistics. According to the American Cancer Society, breast cancer is the leading cancer site among U.S. women. Breast cancer incidence rates are higher. There's a higher incidence of breast cancer among Blacks than whites and for women under the age 45. Also, in terms of mortality, the American Cancer Society reports that cancer is the second leading cause of death in the United States, and that there is a 42% higher mortality rate in Blacks than in whites. And in terms of survival, Black women have lower chances of surviving breast cancer when diagnosed with regional breast cancer, and when diagnosed with distant breast cancer. And these statistics are important because they highlight the special circumstance of being an African American breast cancer survivor in the first place. It's important to understand the context in which these women who've made it into survivorship are able to psychologically adjust to their life post this life-threatening illness. And so I'm going to start out with giving you some more background information about fear of recurrence and what this concept means. Breast cancer is accompanied by a host of psychological, social, and behavioral concerns. Fear of recurrence is one of the most commonly endorsed and reported concerns among breast cancer survivors. And so fear of recurrence is defined as the constant worry or concern that cancer will return in the same breast, in the other breast, or in a different part of the body. In terms of prevalence, fear of recurrence has been described as the most widely experienced concern among cancer survivors because 22 to 99% of cancer survivors are reporting this. And there are several demographic and treatment related factors that increase these feelings of fear about recurrence, including younger age, which younger breast cancer survivors experience this fear more often because younger individuals tend to believe that they have more time on the earth than older individuals do. And so if you are a breast cancer survivor in your 20s, you might feel that there's more time for a recurrence to take place because you're only 20 and you're not old, you're not elderly as most breast cancer survivors are. Marital status has been associated with this, education, income, and some clinical factors have been stage at diagnosis, um, surgery type, and time since diagnosis. And so this is a theoretical model that we've used in another study that we conducted called Leventhal's Common Sense Self-Regulation Model of Illness. This model asserts that fear of recurrence has antecedents and consequences, and that these antecedents stem from the social environment. Such as the conversations that you have with family and friends, family avoiding health discussions, families members worrying about your health, appointments with health professionals, and cancer in the media. These sort of serve as cues that kind of promote these fearful thoughts and cognitions surrounding fear of recurrence. And then once those cognitions are experienced and those fears are realized within breast cancer survivors, there are some psychological consequences, which include anxiety, body or symptom checking, and somatic hyperarousal. And we found when we tested this theory a couple of years ago that we wanted to see if fear of recurrence could serve as a mediator between social constraints, which are some of those social environmental variables I just described. If fear of recurrence could serve as a mediator between in the relationship between social constraints and insomnia, which is a psychophysiological and functional symptom of breast cancer as well. We hypothesized that there would be an indirect effect of social constraints on insomnia through fear of recurrence. And we found that our hypotheses were supported. And our work was published in the Journal of Psycho-Oncology in 2020. This basically, this paper was saying again that social constraints and all of those social constraining variables that I just described, negative comments from family and friends about health, that those comments were directly related to insomnia symptoms in African American breast cancer survivors, and that fears about having a recurrence was one of the mediators or one of the reasons how those negative comments and conversations led to the breast cancer survivors staying up at night and reporting feelings of insomnia. And so this this was the data that was reported in that study. So as mentioned, we found a significant relationship between social constraints on insomnia. We found a significant relationship between social constraints leading to fear of recurrence and also fear of recurrence leading to insomnia, highlighting fear of recurrence really as a mediator in this direct relationship between social constraints and insomnia. So how do we get here? Where we are now with social support and psychological distress and fear of recurrence. Well, after we found those results, we were interested in seeing if fear of recurrence could serve as a mediator in some other relationships that happen within breast cancer survivors. So we decided to look at social support as a coping mechanism to see how that was related to psychological distress, and also wanted to know if fear of recurrence could serve as a mediator in that relationship in the same way that it did with the relationship between social constraints and insomnia. And so for this one, we didn't use Leventhal's common sense model for our theoretical framework. We decided to use the stress and coping model. And this model asserts that individuals use coping mechanisms uh, to approach potentially stressful situations. And when they do that, when they do that, let me go to yes. So that individuals use a variety of coping resources to appraise the stressfulness of a situation. And those coping resources that they use really influence the way they appraise the stressfulness of potential stressors. And once they appraise the situation as being challenging or stressful or not, those appraisals lead to cognitions that influence their psychological health outcomes. That's what the stress and coping model is saying. And that's the model that we used to serve as the basis for selecting the variables for the current study, which is looking at social support and psychological distress and fear of recurrence as a mediator. And this conceptual design illustrates that. So we have our coping resource, which the coping model suggests. Social support is an example of a coping resource. And we have our appraisal situation, which we hypothesized would that fear of recurrence would be an appraisal of a stressful event, with the stressful event being the possibility that breast cancer could recur, and that fear being is something that is an appraisal, and that the psychological health outcome would be anxiety and depression. And so in this study, we really wanted to know if there was a direct relationship between social support, the coping resource, and anxiety and depression, the psychological health outcomes. And we wanted to know if one of the ways through which social support impacts anxiety and depression is through these fears of recurrence and constant unrelenting worries that cancer will return. And if those thoughts are influenced by the social support network and the availability of social support in the social context. And so these were the aims of the current study. We examined the relationship between social support and psychological distress, which is inclusive of anxiety and depression in African American breast cancer survivors. And we also examined fear of recurrence as a mediator in the relationship between social support and psychological distress. Research question 1. Is there a relationship between social support and anxiety? We hypothesized that high social support would be associated with lower anxiety. Research question number 2. Is there a relationship between social support and depression? We hypothesized that high social support would be associated with lower depression. And research question number 3, does fear of recurrence mediate the relationship between social support and anxiety? We hypothesize there would be an indirect effect of social support on anxiety through fear of recurrence. Research question number 4, does fear of recurrence mediate the relationship between social support and depression? And we hypothesized that there would be an indirect effect of social support on depression through fear of recurrence. And so, what did we do to try to answer these research questions and see if our hypotheses are supported? We used data that was already collected as a part of a larger study, which is the study that I described earlier about insomnia that was published in Psycho-Oncology. This was a cross-sectional research survey research study. We provided participants the option to complete the battery of questionnaires, either online or as a hard copy. All of the participants in this study received a breast cancer diagnosis up to stage 4 of breast cancer with no other form of cancer reported. They were complete with treatment at the time of completing these questionnaires with no history of recurrence, no history of schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, or bipolar disorder. And for recruitment, we recruited through 13 community organizations, hospitals, and support groups in the DMV District of Columbia, Maryland, Virginia area. And our recruitment resulted in a total sample of 64 African American breast cancer survivors that we're using for this study. And so these are some of the instruments that were included in the battery of questionnaires that the participants filled out. They filled out a background questionnaire, which included demographic characteristics such as age, education, marital status, and income. We asked about clinical characteristics, for example, time since diagnosis, stage at diagnosis, and surgery type. The participants filled out the Duke UNC Functional Social Support Questionnaire to measure social support. This was calculated with a total score. The concerns about recurrence scale was completed to assess fear of recurrence. And we used the overall concerns index within that scale to assess fear of recurrence for this particular study. And then to measure psychological distress, we used the hospital anxiety and depression scale, which also gives a total score of anxiety, depression, and psychological distress in total. And so these were the results. So in terms of demographics, um, the age ranged of the participants from 22 years old, which is quite young to be a breast cancer survivor, 22 years old to 75 years old, for the 64 individuals included. There was sort of an even split between participants who were married versus not married, or partnered versus not partnered. In terms of education, this was a highly educated sample of participants. Most people had some college or vocational training, whereas only 15 or 14% of the sample had only a high school diploma. In terms of household income, this was a relatively high earning group of individuals with 70% of the sample earning $50,000 or more. And this data was collected in 2018 and the District of Columbia DMV area, so not in the New York City metropolitan area. So $50,000 a year in the DMV area in 2018 was um, considered to be a relatively good amount of income. And results continued. So these are the results of the clinical characteristics from the background questionnaire. So in terms of cancer staging, we had about half of the sample was diagnosed at stage 1, which was really great news. And then the rest of the sample was diagnosed at later stages of tumor development. For surgery type, we were sort of even split between individuals who had a lumpectomy or a breast conserving surgery versus patients who underwent a mastectomy. And for time since diagnosis, on average, these participants were between 8 and 9 years time since diagnosis. And for treatment types, there was a little bit more people who had chemotherapy than not, and but we were somewhere in the middle on that too. So these are the descriptive statistics for the actual study measures, the study characteristics that we measured while we were these were the variables of interest from the battery of questionnaire: the social support, fear of recurrence, psychological distress, anxiety, and psychological distress, depression. So for the social support questionnaire, the average score was a 4.22, where the maximum on that scale was a 5. So the higher the number means the higher levels of social support that was reported by the participants. And so being that the min is 1 and the max is 5, a average score of 4.22 indicates that these individuals were reporting that they had high levels of social support. And this Cronbach's alpha refers to the fit of this measure ability to measure social support within that particular sample. And the alpha being above 0.80 shows that this is an acceptable measure to be used within this sample, and that it's actually capturing what it's supposed to be capturing with the 8 items that it used. And so moving on to the next measure, fear, which was the overall concerns index in the concerns about recurrence scale that was used to measure fear of recurrence. On average, it was reported that of a 2.6, where the min was a 1 and a max was a 6. This seems like it's somewhere in the middle, but on this scale, reporting at least a 2 on the overall concerns index is indicative of experiencing fears of recurrence. And about 67% of this sample reported at least a 2 on this measure, indicating that they experienced fear of recurrence. So this, I would say that this is experienced very broadly and widely across the sample that we are referring to here, at a moderate extent. In terms of the psychological distress indices, the anxiety scale and the depression scale, on average, there was a 5.8 reported on a scale from 0 to 14. For anxiety and for depression, there was a 2.56 reported on a scale from 0 to 11. And the HADS, which is the measure that assesses the anxiety and depression scale, that that questionnaire has cutoff points for what is considered a normal level of psychological distress, an abnormal level, and a clinically significant level of psychological distress. And I'll go over those cutoff points later so that you can kind of see where the participants in this sample kind of fell out, or how they shook out with these measures. So the results continued. For social support, as I mentioned, social support was pretty high. Fear of recurrence, 60.9% of the sample experienced some degree of fear of recurrence by indicating at least a 2 on the overall concerns index. And for psychological distress, these are the cutoff scores that I was referring to on the previous slide. So scores from 0 to 7 indicate normal. Scores from 8 to 10 indicate borderline abnormal, and scores from 11 to 21 indicate abnormal cases. And so as you can see, the means for depression and anxiety being 2.56 and 5.80 fall within the normal category. So this indicates that there were not really, on average, there were not really too many breast cancer survivors in this sample who were experiencing borderline abnormal or abnormal cases of psychological distress in general in this sample. So the results continuing. These are some partial correlations that were conducted between the major study variables. So here we have the correlations between social support, fear of recurrence, anxiety, and depression while controlling for age, stage at diagnosis, and chemotherapy use. And if you can notice in the table, the numbers that have these stars on them, those are numbers that we marked as being statistically significant, where the p-values were less than 0.001. And those relationships were for the relationship between social support and anxiety. So the higher the social support reported by these breast cancer survivors, the lower their anxiety was, because the relationship is negative. And then the negative relationship for depression and social support, negative 0.429 with the 3 stars next to it, indicates that there was a statistically significant relationship between depression and social support, whereas the higher social support, the lower depression those participants experienced. And in terms of fear of recurrence, if you look on the second column with this positive 0.549 with the 3 asterisks next to it, that indicates that there was a positive relationship between fear of recurrence and anxiety, whereas higher fears of recurrence were related to higher levels of anxiety, and there was not a significant relationship between fear of recurrence and depression, with the positive 1.86 in the second column. And so that means that the relationship between fear of recurrence was positive, indicating that higher fears of recurrence was related to higher levels of depression, but it was not statistically significant, meaning that the relationship was not very strong and that those two variables in this sample didn't have too much to do with one another. And so these are the results of the hypotheses that we tested, where we wanted to know if there was a direct relationship between social support and anxiety, and if there was a mediating effect of fear of recurrence on anxiety, if there was a mediating effect of fear of recurrence on the relationship between social support and anxiety. So if you look at the bottom of this figure, the white box towards the at the very bottom, which says indirect effect C prime, which is how you refer to that apostrophe on the letter C. Our standard error was 0.27, and there was a 95 confidence interval from 1.19 to 0. And when you're reading confidence intervals to decide whether a relationship in a correlational study is significant or not, if there is a 0 present within the confidence interval, that means that the relationship is not statistically significant. And so we concluded from this indirect effect, because there clearly is a 0 at the end of the confidence interval, that the relationship between social support and anxiety through fear of recurrence, stating that fear of recurrence is a mediator in the relationship between social support and anxiety, was not significant because of the presence of the 0 in the confidence interval. Now, we did find a direct effect of social support and anxiety, and that can be read by looking at the white box within the middle of this triangle that says direct effect C, with the standard error at 0.43. The p-value was less than 0.001. So there was a pretty strong relationship between social support and anxiety, and it was positive. Well, negative, as we mentioned in the correlations. So that means that the more social support individuals in this sample reported, the lower levels of anxiety they reported, which was great news, and it was supportive of our hypothesis. We also found that there was a positive relationship between fear of recurrence and anxiety, as we expected. And this is on the right side of this triangle, the B, or the beta bar. So the p-value for this was less than 0.001, which is statistically significant, showing that higher levels of fear of recurrence were associated with higher levels of anxiety, which was repetitive from our partial correlation. So it was good that we saw this come out in the next step of the analyses. And then we found that there was not a statistically significant relationship between social support and fear of recurrence. High levels of social support did not necessarily have anything to do with levels of fear of recurrence in this sample. Oh, and these are the findings for depression. So starting over from the bottom of the triangle with the indirect effect of C prime, we did not find that fear of recurrence mediated the relationship between social support and depression in this model either. And I'm reading that to you and making that decision based on looking at the 95% confidence interval. There is a 0. If you put negative 0.33 on a number line with 0.11, there will be a zero in between those two numbers. And so because of that, that is the statistic that we use to determine that there's not a statistically significant relationship between social support and depression. And with the standard error being 0.11, which is quite low, that's another indicator that the relationship is not very strong between social support and depression in this sample. We also, as repeating from the other model, still did not find a relationship between social support and fear of recurrence that was statistically significant. And we did find, though, that there was a relationship between fear of recurrence and depression. The p-value equaled 0.05. So the relationship was not very strong, but it was statistically significant. Whereas higher levels of fear of recurrence was related to higher levels of depression in the sample. And so here we are with the discussion. How do we place these findings within the context of the literature that already exists about this topic? What have other researchers and other labs what have they found in relation to these topics? So, with regard to social support, as I mentioned, in this sample of breast cancer survivors, our scores were quite high. On average, 4.22 on the scale that we used, with a standard deviation of 0.97, meaning that there was not a whole ton of variation amongst between the participants, that the majority of them were reporting around this same average of 4.22 on this scale. That speaks volumes that there was a lot of social support reported by the participants in this sample. Well, we found that this was echoing the literature. In 2008, Shelby and colleagues assessed social support in an African American sample of breast cancer survivors. They didn't use the Duke UNC social support questionnaire to measure social support. They used the interpersonal support evaluations list short form, but their averages sort of came out sort of as ours did. So their mean reported was 55.75, with the range of values on that scale being from 16 to 64. And 55.75 is quite close to the maximum that they could have scored on that scale, showing that African American breast cancer survivors in general, when asked about their social support availability, tend to report that they have a lot of available social support available to them. And that's a very important thing to know for the literature, because that's an opportunity that psychotherapists and hospitals can use to use that social support to help them psychologically adapt healthily to breast cancer survivorship. So that was a big win for this study. In terms of fear of recurrence, we found that 60.9% of our sample reported experiencing some level of fear of recurrence. This was also consistent with what previous studies have found. So in 2012, Taylor and colleagues assessed fear of recurrence using the exact same measure that we used in a sample of African American breast cancer survivors, and actually even in the same geographic location in the United States, and reported that 67% of the sample reported experiencing some level of fear of recurrence as well. So that was also a big win in the literature to show that this is a persistent issue. That data was published in 2012. This data was collected in 2018, and it's still going on within African American breast cancer survivors, this fear of recurrence. In terms of psychological distress, 38% of our sample scored at least an 8 on HADS anxiety. 9% scored at least an 8 on HADS depression. Our means for psychological distress were quite low, meaning that there were not a whole bunch of participants on average. The majority of the participants on average were not scoring above an 8 or at least an 8 on the HADS anxiety or HADS depression scales. But of the individuals who did report that they were experiencing anxiety or depression, because there were some people who did, there were 38% of them were experiencing high levels or borderline abnormal levels of anxiety, and 9% of them were experiencing borderline symptoms of depression. And this was a similar result to what Shepard and colleagues reported in 2014. They used the exact same measure, the hospital anxiety and depression scale, and a sample of African American breast cancer survivors, and reported that 32% of their sample scored at least an 8 on this measure of anxiety and depression within that sample, which is quite close to what we also found, with 38% and 9% reporting above an 8 on the HADS. And then what about our hypotheses surrounding the mediating effect of fear of recurrence on the relationship between social support and anxiety? High social support was associated with low psychological distress. That was our first hypothesis. And this was consistent with previous studies, and also it's consistent with what the stress and coping models suggest should be happening. So if you can remember back in the presentation earlier, I described that the stress and coping model identifies social support as a coping resource that helps people appraise the stressfulness of a situation, and that appraisal then leads to psychological health outcomes such as anxiety and depression. And we found that there's a direct relationship between social support and anxiety and depression, which is supportive of the theoretical model that we used for this study. So what about fear of recurrence serving as a mediator or or a type of appraisal? Our hypothesis around this was not supported. Fear of recurrence did not serve as a mediator in this relationship, and we have some possible reasons for why that might be. Fear of recurrence might be more of a psychological outcome and not really the result of an appraisal. There might be an appraisal that happens before individuals get to the point where they're now fearful and worried about having a recurrence that could be serving as a mediator between social support and fear of recurrence. Um, I think a win of of us finding that fear of recurrence isn't a mediator is to really focus on the strength of the relationship between social support and psychological distress. We're showing here that whether participants are worrying about having a cancer recurrence or not, social support is such a strong implicator for psychological health and lower anxiety and depression, that even with fears of recurrence, the social support is strong enough to help lower anxiety and depression. And how could this study continue? How could researchers take these results and make things better for breast cancer survivors? I think a longitudinal study would allow for further exploration of these relationships over time. Looking at this in a diverse group of survivors with variable income and education, since this sample was a high earning group of breast cancer survivors with very high education, and also exploring the relationships among various gender categories. We missed an opportunity in our background questionnaire to ask about gender in this study. And so we are missing that data. We don't know if there are people in this sample who are members of the LGBTQ plus population. And so that's missing data that was really on us, that we didn't ask that simply in the demographic questionnaire. And so we don't know if there are differences in these relationships among various genders. And so future studies should definitely do that. And I think these results are important and for family-based models of care and helping with breast cancer survivors. And if I hope I left enough room for comments and questions. Feel free to enter any comments that you may have about this study in the chat. But thank you all for your attention. And it was a pleasure presenting this data to you all.
Thank you, Chloe. I have a question for you. I'll get us started, and it's not so much about the topic, but more about the process, I think.
Yes.
And you and I were having a conversation before about this, so I thought it would be interesting to hear your take on it in front of the audience. But I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about the peer review process and two things in particular. First, how you help students understand the significance of that process. And then second, to talk a little bit about how that process has or will potentially continue to shape this particular project.
Yes, that's an excellent question. So this paper is currently being refereed and going through this peer review process. So this paper was submitted to the Journal of Cancer Survivorship, and the journal found that this particular article wasn't the best fit for that journal. They would have preferred that this study had a control group to be published in that study, which by nature, correlational studies do not have control groups. And so if you can think back to the limitations section where I said this would be really great if we could do a longitudinal study to examine this over time. That journal likes to publish papers that have already done longitudinal work instead of correlational. And that's fine because it's a more rigorous form of research, but correlational research is still extremely important because it serves as the foreground of the basis for someone having the justification to then go do a longitudinal study because we found preliminarily that these relationships exist and they should be further studied. And so that is a part of this peer review process. You take time to do these research studies and you make them rigorous. You are collaborative. This is a collaboration that I have with Howard University Hospital. And so you're collaborative and you work with a team and you submit to journals, and peers, other scientists in the scientific community review the results, and they decide which journal is a journal that's best fitting for this to be published in. And also me presenting this topic to you all in this space and receiving critical comments and critical questions from students and faculty who in a multidisciplinary institution like FIT is also a part of the peer review process, because you all are asking me questions to make me challenge and think about the thing that I've been kind of tunnel visioned looking at for the past 5 years or so by now, because you all are new eyes looking at this. And so from this conversation and from this discussion, I will then go back and kind of view this data in maybe a different way from what you guys are asking me, and maybe craft the discussion section in a different way, or write the limitation section a different way. Maybe there are limitations that I haven't thought of before that maybe someone might bring up here. And so presenting this and students asking critical questions and challenging scientific results and what they mean and how we collected the data, and thinking critically about these concepts from in all different types of forums, in classrooms, through this library presentation, at research conferences, and from journal reviewers, is all a part of making this study, the results of this study, be considered rigorous and credible, so that as soon when it is published, it's considered one of those credible sources that we want to cite.
Thank you. I think you have some good questions in the chat. I'll ask them. The first one's from Ramona. Ramona says, "Thanks so much for sharing this study, Chloe. What is the clinical distinction between anxiety and depression?"
Okay, that's a very good question. So, um, anxiety and depression together, happening collectively, has been described in the literature as psychological distress, general psychological distress. And within psychological distress, you have anxiety, which is feelings of stress, that sort of like thinking of your sympathetic nervous system and the increased heart rate, and the autonomic responses that take place within your sympathetic nervous system when you feel that you're faced with a stressor and you are uncontrollably aroused in that moment. That is the feeling of anxiety. And then when you think about the opposite end of that with your parasympathetic nervous system, that is the calming part of your HPA axis and the stress response cycle. That is the calming part. And when those two are out of whack or out of range, and they're in dysregulation, that's when you have issues with anxiety and depression, because the parasympathetic is supposed to be calming and relaxing, but over a longer period of time, if you're too calm and you're too relaxed and you're not able to be aroused when necessary, that's when you can have a clinical diagnosis of depression. And then on the flip side, if you're always aroused and you're not able to calm down, and the anxiety is prolonging and you're always in that sympathetic aroused state, that can lead to generalized anxiety disorder. And so the midway, or the combination of this generalized anxiety disorder and this major depressive disorder together, is psychological distress, because you have issues with regulating the both of them at the same time.
Thank you. You
Mhm.
have a thank you from Patrick. Fantastic job.
Thank
Um, from Gloria and Yvette, they say, what made you choose breast cancer specifically for your research?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. So, breast cancer, I think I mean, I self-identify as woman, as female, cisgender female, and I've always been interested in the way that cancer impacts families and groups of individuals. And when I first started in cancer research, I was in prostate cancer prevention, and so I was working with a lot of male identifying individuals, and I started to wonder, I wonder how these experiences are amongst women and how this impacts women. And I was really interested in just research on the psychology of womanhood, really, and sexuality. And so that's what kind of led me into breast cancer research. I was interested in the impact of a mastectomy on identity, the impact of a lumpectomy on identity, and screening behavior amongst African American women who tend to be viewed as the matriarch of very large families, and what that means to be a breast cancer survivor or a breast cancer patient when you're carrying so much. And not just African American women, I think many women throughout history have been having these gender roles of being the person in the home that is the mother to everyone, the nurturer to everyone. And what does that mean? Or what happens when this figure has goes through a diagnosis of breast cancer? What happens to the family? How do people respond? Who becomes the mother of the mother? So that's where I started with this many years ago, when I was just first starting out with my training in cancer research. And my mind has expanded since then, but that's really where I was thinking when I first started.
The next question is from Matthew. What were the occupations of the subjects, and how did you acquire your 64 subjects, and were they employed at the time of the study?
Those are excellent questions. So I don't recall, I do not believe we asked what the specific vocational, I don't think we had a question in the background questionnaire about vocation and what they actually did as their job. We asked about education and income, so we knew that they were high earning, and that they were also highly educated. There were several people who had PhDs and MDs, so I know that. There were several people with advanced degrees and master's degrees. Most of the people had over high school education. There were people with tech degrees. I remember there being someone who was a cosmetologist, who I interacted quite heavily with during the study. So most people had education. How did we collect the data? So we formed formal collaborations with 13 community organizations within that geographic area of the United States. And the community organizations included breast cancer survivor support groups that were offshoots from hospitals. We recruited within like the waiting rooms of different hospitals. We recruited through several churches and some of their health ministries that they have. And we reached out and really collaborated with 64 organizations. No, it was on 64 organizations, but we ended up only recruiting from 13 of them. So, and then once we built those relationships, which took a very long time to build, because when you're working with sensitive populations, you can't just kind of shoot in and say, hey, answer my research questions and then leave. You have to continue to maintain a relationship with these organizations because you're asking for sensitive information, and you're asking for their time, and you're asking them to reveal very sensitive topics that they've lived through. And it can be very vulnerable experience to have someone answer questions like this about, are you afraid to have a recurrence, especially if they actually are. For them to disclose that is you're asking them to be very vulnerable. And so that's how we collected the data. We passed out some of the participants preferred to fill out the questionnaire as a hard copy. And then we also had an online version where on RedCap, so some of the patients or the participants were able to fill out the questions that way as well.
Okay, the next question is from Amy. Has fear of recurrence been studied with any other kinds of correlations? For example, access to medical information or family history?
Yes. So access to medical information, I actually haven't seen that in the literature being associated with fear of recurrence, but that's a very interesting concept to even explore future research with. So there has been data showing that individuals experience fear when they are made aware of the results of genetic counseling and screening results. And those are members of the cancer population that are not cancer patients, but what we call previvors, or individuals who are at a genetic risk for types of cancers, and they go and try to be proactive by getting genetic testing or go get screening earlier than they're clinically indicated to. And there is research showing that there is fear about having cancer or getting cancer in the first place in that population, especially when they're receiving the results of genetic testing and the results of these screening measures. And I would assume, especially when there's a family history as well, that would prompt the fear even more. But in terms of survivors, cancer survivors, I have not seen that being related to that concept, but I think that's really, really interesting. That's a very, very good point, Amy. Thank you for that.
Okay, Deborah asks, have you explored the relationship of different levels of social support to anxiety/depression within the context of breast cancer in women?
No, I have not, but that is very interesting. So in the paper that I discussed when I first opened up, where it was in the Journal of Psycho-Oncology, and we found that social constraints was related to insomnia. Social constraints in particular is a type of social support. So social constraints is this phenomenon where you're receiving critical and not like unsupportive comments from family and friends when you're trying to discuss a stressor or your illness. So anytime the patient brings up their breast cancer experience or chemo or having to go to a breast cancer survivor support group, maybe their son or their husband or their friend or their wife who lives with them is saying, "Oh, I don't want to hear that," or kind of shushing the conversation. That experience is social constraints. And we found that it was directly related to feelings of insomnia. We haven't looked at psychological distress in relation to that, but I would think that is a type of social support. Having emotional support available, I think, is another form of support that I think is really interesting and could really be useful for future research on this. Thank you.
It looks like you have one more question from Ramona. Um, Ramona writes, clearly this is personal because I know too many breast cancer survivors. You mentioned the opportunity around social support. With Grace Be Bold is a small startup retail brand founded by a young woman who is the daughter of a survivor. Do you see opportunities for FIT students to incorporate this research to develop products and brands that might help with the social support?
That's a very interesting question. So, one thing that has been really, really great within the breast cancer population is this identity and meaning making that has happened within breast cancer and all types of cancers. So, this pink ribbon that goes around as being representative of breast cancer, and even the idea of referring to breast cancer patients who've completed chemotherapy as survivors, I think there's a lot of identity and cohesion there in the breast cancer space and in the cancer population in general. And I like some of the work that's being done in the DTech lab around identity and cohesion and meaning making. They're currently collaborating with the Girl Scouts of America on their uniforms and finding ways to change the way those uniforms are and increase their levels of modernity with how those uniforms look. And I would like to see something that is more modern in terms of the identity and image and the clothing of the clothing around breast cancer. It's very gendered, and that's one issue that has happened within cancer because some of these cancer types impact organs that we've associated with genders, right? So you have breast cancer, which impact breasts, and we associate that with women. Prostate cancer, we associate that illness with men. Cervical cancer, we associate that with women. And so there's a very gender biased thing that happens within the cancer industry that not that I think, but I know research has shown there's that gender bias creates psychological distress because there's not a big emphasis on addressing the variety of genders and sexual orientations and gender identifications that exist within the patient population. And this pink breast cancer ribbon, pink is a very powerful color. As we know from the great topic that was discussed about the color pink in our museum at FIT, the color pink is a very, very powerful color, and it represents strength. It also represents femininity. It can be soft, but I'd like to see some type of rainbow imaging, in sort of the clothing that breast cancer survivors wear to represent being a survivor, and not just the color pink. I've in the support groups that I've been to, um, I have interacted with some, and I regret that we did not assess that in this study, which that's a major limitation of this study is that we did not accurately capture gender here. But it would have been really, really interesting and important for us to understand how gender is really impacting identity amongst this breast cancer survivor population where everything is pink. Um, what about transgender men who have breast cancer or transgender women who have breast cancer, who are more androgynous or masculine, who may not really like the color pink? Do they have that same, do they get to benefit from that same level of camaraderie of being a breast cancer survivor with this pink stuff everywhere? I think that's something that definitely could go very far with FIT students with design and product development for the cancer population, most definitely.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Martin, for sharing your work with us today. It was really just wonderful and it's such important work. So I'm glad I was here to learn from you today. And thank you, everybody, for coming to FIT Author Talks. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I hope that you will join us for the next Author Talks where we will be featuring Hillary Davidson. Thank you very much and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chloe.
Bye.